It's Monday morning and we're on the Paragon in Bath, and just to show you where I am, this is next to the Countess of Huntingdon's Chapel, the Museum of Bath Architecture, and I'm just going to have a wander around and take you to a little folk horror site, the house of Angela Carter, who wrote The Company of Wolves. Okay, this is Hay Hill in central Bath, and this is where Angela Carter lived. Now, the bookshop in which I work, there are a couple of older customers who actually knew Angela when she lived in Bath. This was in the mid to late 70s, and she lived in one of these houses, I think either number 5 or number 6, and last time I came here they had blue doors. They've been repainted green, and I can't recall which one of these it was, but it was one of these. So I'll check in the biography and pop it in a little title card. If I can't find it in the biography, I'll check with Christopher Frayling or somebody like that. But as you see, quite a nice little street. So I'll just give you a 180 in a moment. So this is the setting. I think at that time she would have been writing things like The Passion of New Eve and some of the short stories which would have appeared maybe in Company of Wolves. There we go. So it was one of those. It's one of these houses here. As I say, I'll try and pin down which one it is. And she met her partner because he was working on the building across the street. It's a painter and decorator, a plasterer, something like that. I wouldn't say Bath has any particular association with folk horror apart from the Angela Carter connection, but of course there is a sort of gothic heritage here. Obviously Jane Austen is the one person who gets mentioned again and again in Bath when it comes to writers, and of course her novel Northanger Abbey is widely regarded as a parody of a gothic novel. There are some people who say that Northanger Abbey is actually a horror novel, a gothic novel, and this view is put forward in a book called Horror 100 Best Books, edited by Stephen Jones and Kim Newman. And this is the assembly rooms. I've done lots of bookstalls at the Bath Lit Fest here in the past, and somebody who's come onto that sort of, that chattering classes kind of thing recently is the knowledge that Mary Shelley spent some time in Bath completing Frankenstein. It's actually an edition of Frankenstein, which taken from the original manuscript, and it shows by highlighting the text which parts are actually written by or edited or revised by Shelley. That's Percy Shelley, of course, and it does make you wonder, because of course Frankenstein was inspired to a degree by the conversations that Byron and Shelley had about Galvanism and the life source. So my theory is possibly that Percy had a bigger part in the writing of the novel than anybody wants to admit, because of course it fits in well with feminist narratives. There's no doubt obviously that Mary actually wrote most of it. She was very, very young, but there's no doubt that Shelley had a hand in helping her. Of course, if you read Shelley's own gothic novels, they're not exactly masterworks, and I think they're probably long out of print. They used to be in Oxford Classics. This is the Circus, Bath's famous round street. I'm just going to show it to you now, bear with me. And there are at least 2 haunted houses here that I know of. One of them was mentioned prominently in the Faber Book of Ghost Stories, which was edited by somebody from Bath. I can't for the life of me think what their name was, and I don't have a copy anymore. But there were at least 4 local ghost stories, which is a lot for one city, so it shows they were scrabbling for material. Here at number 37 we have Mary Shelley's The House of Frankenstein. I doubt whether Mary Shelley had much to do with this because it was only set up last year. And as you can see, you can book for tickets. Victor's Lair Escape Room. I haven't actually been in here, and I'm a bit divided about whether an escape room is what I want from a Frankenstein museum come attraction. And I think it's very much more, it's hard to tell from their website and Facebook feed, because it does seem to be half and half. Some of it is serious, some of it is frivolous. I think I prefer it more serious. One wonders, do they have any decent Japanese import Blu-rays on sale in this gift shop? I somehow doubt it, but we'll see one day. Weird, of course, is an Old English word, maybe Anglo-Saxon, meaning fate. I was always fascinated when reading Moorcock's Elric books, where there's a part where Elric talks about pursuing his weird. And I always thought that was great, and I didn't realise that it meant fate. But I had a kind of inkling that it meant something like that. But I love the idea of pursuing my weird. Which leads me on nicely to a little discussion of a writer called Brian Bates. And this is a shop called Weird in Bath. How weird is it? I'll just show you the window a little bit so you can have an idea. Seems mostly to be stained glass windows, terribly reflective of course. And look at that, you've got a bit of a Viking ship there with a little dragon prow and all that sort of thing. And you notice the gambolling hares, very Wicker Man. Okay, well I hope you enjoyed that little stroll around my hometown, taking some of the horror sites. But now on to some folk horror favourite films, which as promised I finally got around to. Well, I thought I might start with the big 3, but then no, I thought we'll come on to the big 3 a bit later. And let's look at an earlier film, which we could call folk horror, and this is The White Reindeer. And this is the original Eureka edition in the limited slipcase, as they do. Just pop that out there, show you the alternative cover. And I only saw this the first time a couple of years ago, and it's really, really good. And it's black and white, and I'll tell you a bit about it. It's Finnish. It was by somebody called Erik Blomberg, and it is described on the rear of the sleeve as one of world cinema's criminally underseen masterpieces. And it's Lapland, and of course Lapland covers part of Finland and part of Norway, I seem to remember. It's a sort of place rather than a country. So rather like folk horror, it doesn't fit within defined boundaries. It's just where the Lapps live, and they are nomadic people, and of course they live through sort of reindeer farming out in the wild. And it's a 4K restoration, and this was made in 1952, and it's 68 minutes long, and I think it's still available, and I would really recommend it. It's fantastic. It's very cool and cold and stark, and it's sort of very much based on folk beliefs. And the White Reindeer is a supernatural being, and I won't really tell you any more than that. I think you should seek it out for yourself, because it does sort of riff on the vampire legend a bit, but it's absolutely fantastic and great little film. So if you can find it, do. And you know, it is sort of like, I would say it's one of the purest folk horror things. It does have the feel of a fairy tale, and this edition has, you know, reversible sleeve, 2 discs, what have you. I really recommend it. I think it's one of the few genuine folk horror things which are out there, because despite what I've been saying, where I've become more open-minded to what is and what isn't folk horror, I do think you have to have limits. In his book Hauntology, Merlin Coverley, who's really good on these sort of things, he says that he feels that folk horror seems to lose its meaning once it gets outside a certain place and time. And I have said that I think, you know, it's sort of, it has to be about superstitious spiritual beliefs, folk beliefs, which are irrational, pre-enlightenment and alternative, and also that it has to be rooted in place. And by place, I mean a rural place. And even though we talk about the different folk beliefs around the world, I'm quite keen on the idea that folk horror refers specifically to Eurocentric beliefs. And as it's something which arose in discussion of British cinema, I think to be really purist, we should really talk about British films. But of course, you know, there's other views as well. So that's the White Reindeer from Finland. We'll look at the big three now, the obvious things. And of course, we cleave to the Wicker Man, naturally, as we would. And we cleave to Blood on Satan's Claw, Piers Haggard, as we would, and we cleave to Witchfinder General. I have slightly mixed feelings about Witchfinder, because to me it's sort of very much a historical film. There's horrific things in it, obviously, but it is historic. So, you know, that's one aspect. So looking at, we've got crime horror, and we've actually got fantasy here, supernatural horror. You'll recall me talking about genres and how I've said that horror to me is not a genre, it's a bricolage. Any number of things can be horror, but they will almost always fall into science fiction, fantasy, and by fantasy I mean supernatural, or criminal acts which make them horrific. If you try and find a horror film which isn't sort of take place, the horror doesn't come from a science fiction type source, a supernatural fantasy source, or a criminal source, then I'd really be interested to hear about it. So there we go, because of course it's the acts in sort of realistic horror, in crime horror, that make them into horror. So Witchfinder General kind of falls in that category, really. So that's the big three. I'm not going to say too much more about those because everybody knows them. And moving on, I've pulled a load of films out, and I've probably got about 500 films on DVD, Blu-ray. I'm quite choosy. I know 500 sounds like a lot, but I have film fans who have a lot more. But just to look at a few more things. I mean, a film which I've really enjoyed in recent years and watched a number of times is The Ritual, based on the novel by Adam Neville. And even though it doesn't contain all the detail of the novel, the black metal thing, what have you, and if you haven't read the novel, do, it's fantastic. You know, it is very, very much folk horror. It's set in the Nordic setting again. And, you know, there are certain affinities with the White Reindeer, I would say. And it's very, very good cast. And it introduces an interesting element which isn't in the book, about the chap whose lives the friends are celebrating, who was killed in an incident in a shop in London. And that's not in the novel at all. So it's quite interesting. So it's well worth reading the book and watching the film as well. My friend Tom Toner, the science fiction writer, doesn't like the film. He thinks it's nothing compared to the book, but I think they're both good in their own way, I must say. So The Ritual, one of the recent horror films I've enjoyed. I'm very critical of horror. I don't think there's a lot of great work going on. There's odd things here. Most of the really popular stuff I think is rubbish, quite frankly. This was popular, and you know, rightly so. It's really, really good. Something I would describe as folk horror, very much so, is Halloween 3. Season of the Witch, and this is an American Blu-ray, and of course this is written by Nigel Quatermass Neal, and somewhere here I've got another edition which I'm just going to grab a moment and pop in the frame, and that's my old DVD of it, and I think I kept that because I think there's a bonus feature on this, probably a commentary by Kim Newman or somebody like that, which isn't on the Blu-ray, and of course this riffs on the Standing Stone thing, and it's a lot more interesting than the other Halloween films. I mean, I like the first one. The first one's great, don't get me wrong. But I'm not really that interested in the others. Slasher movies don't really do it for me in a big way, with a few iconic examples. So if you've never seen Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, there's nice connections to Quatermass, aka the Quatermass Conclusion, Quatermass 4, as it's sometimes called, The Night Nobody Came Home. And Neil kind of objected to this because he didn't like the way that John Carpenter and his sort of crew dealt with this. And you know, it's great though. I really like it, and it's Tommy Lee Wallace is the actual director. Of course, Carpenter was involved with it. It feels like Carpenter all the way through, but I really like it. I think it's a cracking little film, and I think it just about qualifies as folk horror. And you know, it does have a slight science fiction element. Very, very good. So Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, great stuff, even though a lot of the people in the fan base really, really don't like it. Then on to three obvious faves, working left to right. The Company of Wolves, of course. Angela Carter, based on two stories from her short story collection, The Bloody Chamber. The stories are The Company of Wolves and Wolf Alice, and other material as well, made by Neil Jordan, who later on made a terrible mess of Interview with a Vampire by casting Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, who are completely miscast, good in their own way and the right things. He should have really gone with David Sylvian and Steve Jansen from Japan and made an art film, but what can you do? But Company of Wolves still really, really good, and absolutely fantastic. Sarah Patterson in the Little Red Riding Hood role, absolutely gorgeous. So beautiful. Don't know what really happened to her. She didn't seem to do a lot after that, but really great stuff, and an old favourite. Got very fond memories of watching that in the cinema in Caerphilly when it came out in 1984. Gosh, those were the days. Then a bit of a guilty pleasure, Rawhead Rex, based on the short story by Clive Barker from the Books of Blood, and you know, a very silly film, and hugely influenced, I would say, by the BBC ghost story for Christmas called Stigma, which many people have said should probably be called Stigmata, but Stigma kind of works really in a strange way. And you know, it's very similar in that Standing Stone gets uprooted by some people not really thinking about folk traditions, and it unleashes this demon, this strange being, Rawhead Rex, and it's quite a funny film really. It's hard to take it seriously, but I do really enjoy it, I have to say. And you know, it's very, very daft and everything, because this is an Arrow edition, reversible sleeve, you know the routine. So if you haven't seen it, do see it and do read the story. The story is fantastic. Somewhere here I've got signed copies of the Books of Blood. I must dig them out and do a video about them at some point. So there we go. And of course Kill List, which is the only film I really like by Ben Wheatley. I have said I'm not really very fond of Amy Jump's screenwriting. I think she really sort of like does seem to sort of derail him. Maybe she doesn't, maybe he's the weak factor, but this is great. I really liked this and I thought that was good. And you know, it's got Neil Maskell in it, who's always completely compelling, and you know, he's marvelous in the original version of Utopia, the TV series. I haven't seen the remake. He's always really good, always compelling, fantastic actor. And of course it looks like a crime film, and it's a classic example of that thing where people say, oh, but it's a crime film. It's not. You know, it's crime horror. It's very, very much folk horror, and the supernatural is in it. But of course, does anything supernatural actually happen? That's a good question. So that's the sort of query, yes. So looking there, we've very much got supernatural fantasy with Company of Wolves. We've got definite supernatural fantasy with Rawhead Rex, and we've got supernatural beliefs very much in Kill List. Now some lesser known films possibly to folk horror fans. On the far left there we have Equus, featuring Richard Burton and Peter Firth, based on the play by Peter Shaffer. Of course, Peter Shaffer is the brother of the Shaffer who co-wrote The Wicker Man. And Equus isn't really folk horror, but there is something pagan about it. If you're not familiar with it, there was a play with Daniel Radcliffe, a production which, you know, avoid like the plague. I can't imagine Radcliffe pulling it off, though apparently he was very good. Do stick with the film, which is really quite shocking and amazing. And I saw the film in the cinema when it first came out, very early 80s. It was a double A. The double A certificate was between an A for adult and an X for, you know, sort of 18-year-olds plus. And the double A, you had to be 14 to get in. And it features Jenny Agutter, who at that point was still in that phase where everything she was in, apart from the Railway Children, she was guaranteed to get her kit off, as they say. And not that that was a draw, of course, he said laughingly. But it's a really good film. It's about a young man who is brought up in a very, very, very strict religious household, and he develops his own mythology and his own obsession with horses. And there is a sort of element of fetishism, and it's very dark, but it feels very pagan because he has this relationship with a psychiatrist played by Richard Burton, who does these very intense monologues. And basically Burton is obsessed with his hobby is looking at ancient Greece, the pagan world of ancient Greece, and he finds the sort of fulfillment that the boy finds in his obsession with horses, which culminates in a dreadful crime which is really, really quite horrific. And you know, no spoilers here because that's revealed very near the beginning. And you see this sort of dichotomy between the civilized world of psychiatry and the urges which live within Burton, and the fact that, you know, he actually sort of envies the boy. And it's a great sort of look at comparative belief and the sort of dissatisfactions of rationalism versus the sort of fulfillment of the pagan and the heathen. So it's pretty interesting stuff, really. I really recommend it. Is it folk horror? No. I wouldn't say it is folk horror, though it does have horrific moments, so it's a kind of borderline one, but it's certainly related to, and I would recommend anybody who likes folk horror to see it. It's a brilliant, brilliant film anyway, absolutely superb. There's a BFI Blu-ray of it. In the middle is Night of the Eagle, with Peter Wyngarde, Janet Blair and Margaret Johnson, which is pretty much in the same ballpark as Night of the Demon, aka Curse of the Demon, which most folk horror fans will know and love, because of course it's the film version of Casting the Runes by M.R. James. This is actually based on a novel by Fritz Leiber called Conjure Wife, which is a fantastic novel. Fritz Leiber was the man who coined the term sword and sorcery. He was a Shakespearean actor, science fiction and fantasy and horror writer, and he was active from the late 30s right up until his time of death, which was the late 80s, or maybe early 90s. I think it was late 80s. And Leiber is a very talented man, and Conjure Wife is a fantastic book. It's about a university lecturer who discovers that all women actually are witches. And there's a similarity there with Night of the Demon, with Dana Andrews' character who's a skeptic, and it's all about that, and it's really great, and it pops up on TV now and again. It's black and white, early 60s, so if you've not seen it, do check it out. It's really good, and it's quite a faithful adaptation, but it lacks Leiber's sort of lightness of tone and wit, and Leiber was a really talented author and really, really important in the development of genre fiction in the 20th century, so this is a much watch. Is it folk horror? Well, irrational beliefs, witches, what have you, I guess you could put a claim it really, but as you see, you know, it's set in the USA. Equus is set in the UK, so we're maybe getting out of that area that Merlin Coverley sort of defines really. Then a newer film, The Ghoul, Gareth Tunley, and it features a lady who's in one of Ben Wheatley's films, Sightseers, and this is really good, and it's quite hard to categorise, which is one of its strengths, and well worth a view. I bought this entirely on spec. It's pretty much the day it came out, because I thought this looks amazing, and it is one of the best examples of recent British weird cinema. I'm not going to say too much about it, I just say watch it. Of course, there are lots of films called The Ghoul. There's the one from the 1930s. The one I'd really love is the Tyburn one from the 70s, which has only had a really, really crappy DVD release in a box set. And that's a fantastic thing. Tyburn were very like Hammer. They were like a rip-off of Hammer, and it had Veronica Carlson, Peter Cushing, and it's really great, the 70s version of The Ghoul. But they're different films, they're different stories, and nothing to do with each other. They just share the title. And this is really good. If you like Field in England, if you like Kill List, you love this. It's really, really great. So that's The Ghoul by Gareth Tunley. As I say, I'm not entirely sure it's folk horror, but it's definitely of interest to folk horror fans. So again, two more recent films. Dark Song, a lot of you are familiar with, and is it folk horror? Well, it's about magic with a K, Crowley type magic. It's very good, set in the Welsh countryside, low budget. I really enjoyed it. It's different to the usual run-of-the-mill thing. It's restrained. The acting is really good. The casting is really good. Another one set in Britain, but this is sort of like an American film, is Christina Ricci and The Gathering, which is set in the West Country, in Wiltshire, in Somerset, I would say, where I live. And it involves a small town, which is a bit like Wells or Glastonbury, and a young American girl comes across a secret stone circles, a strange church, those sort of things. And it's the way it's made isn't that great. It's a bit sort of clunky in parts and a bit too gleamy Hollywood, and doesn't quite come off. But it's a really good script, and I think that's what drew me to it. The writing's really good, even though the execution does lack. And it's well worth a look. It's got some great ideas in it. As I say, execution maybe not. You can pick it up pretty cheap. That's The Gathering. Some quick sidebars now. When you really look at your collection of DVDs and Blu-rays and whatever you stream, the fact is there isn't really a heck of a lot of folk horror. They're not the real thing. There's lots of things which you could claim for it, and I guess these are things that we'll talk about, whether we can claim them for folk horror. You know, the old werewolf narrative, you know, is a common one that's claimed, especially the way it's done in The Wolfman, with the wolfbane blooming, and, you know, the rhyme and the gypsies and what have you. But, you know, It's straightforward supernatural horror, because of course all supernatural horror, you know, cleaves to sort of superstitious pre-enlightenment beliefs. So, you know, what can you say? If everything like that is folk horror, then virtually all fantasy horror is folk horror. So it's probably a bit too broad, but this is sort of Paul Nash's sort of werewolf films. Curse of the Devil, it's had various titles, very silly, but they're great fun. An interesting Californian film made in a small budget that you hear a lot about, and I think this is deleted at the moment, is Equinox. And it's a film about a group of teenagers. They go out into the wilderness in California, and you know, how many times have we heard that as the beginning of a horror film? And it was made on a very low budget in the 60s, and it's got sort of occult stuff in it. It's very, very strange, and there's all sorts of sort of creatures and things in it. The effects are very ropey and cheap, very imaginative. If you don't know Equinox, I'd say look it up and read about it and try and get hold of a copy, because it is kind of interesting. It does have a reputation which is probably bigger and better than the film itself, but if you like you know, unusual horror films, I'd say definitely go for it. Is it folk horror? Probably not, but you know, if you want folk horror in California, maybe it is. And I just wanted to mention one of my favourite films, sure, Cat People by Jacques Tournier. Val Newton, you know, absolutely brilliant stuff. I can't get enough of Val Newton. I wish there was more available. And this was remade, of course, in the 80s by Paul Schrader, the David Bowie song, and the remake's good, but you know, the original about Irina, a Serbian girl who, you know, as soon as she has any sexual desires, turns into a Black Panther, is, you know, is just like a classic. And if you haven't seen it, it's very poetic and beautiful. And there's a wonderful fantasy sequel called Curse of the Cat People, which is very gentle and childlike and wonderful, and it's great stuff. So is it folk horror? Well, you know, it is in the way that maybe it's a little bit like, it has the sort of feel of, say, Night of the Eagle and Night of the Demon, aka Curse of the Demon. Is black and white. It's much earlier. It's probably better made. Tournier, of course, was involved with Night of the Demon as well. And it's just a lovely, lovely little film. So I guess these are a few sort of like sidebar faves, really, which you could arguably go for as folk horror, but they're probably not if we're going to be reductionist about it. We'll finish with a few witchcraft-based films, which obviously have had an influence over folk horror cinema, even though, again, if we want to be purist, they are just supernatural fantasy horror. Even, you know, there are some rural locations and what have you. Devil Rides Out, of course, from Hammer, wonderful Dennis Wheatley adaptation that we all know and love, with the Goat of Menzies there. Ghost of Mendes, not Menzies. Menzies, of course, was the newsagent we used to have, where I bought my first Philip K. Dick a long, long time ago, about 1976. And you know, this is great stuff, you know, and we all know and love this. And if you've never seen it, you've got to see it. It's brilliant. This is an American Blu-ray with a rather handsome cover. There's a restored version, which is, you know, worth seeing. People have different views about that, but I love it. You know, it's an old favourite, and definitely a favourite Hammer from that period. Then, of course, a very influential film indeed, Mario Bava's Black Sunday, aka Mask of the Devil, Mask of Satan, with the very wonderful Barbara Steele, of course, as British actress, and had a very long career in horror, particularly in Italy, in Canada with David Cronenberg and what have you. And Witchcraft, vampires, absolutely marvellous stuff, and it's black and white, great period feel. And, you know, we could fall down the rabbit hole of Italian cinema here. We're not going to, we're just going to sort of give it a nod, really. It's fantastic. And then City of the Dead, you know, a rather sort of underrated film, which is growing on me as the years go by. Made by the Amicus guys before they became Amicus, very Lovecraftian in feel, sort of Salem, small town, witchcraft, black and white, you know, Christopher Lee. Really good, and again, it's got that sort of feel that films like Night of the Demon and Night of the Eagle have. And, you know, it's a little bit more limited. It's got Valentine Dial, the man in black from the old BBC radio serials of the 40s and 50s. He's in it. And, you know, it's a great little movie, actually. You can't go wrong. You know, it's slight, beautifully made. And this is a fantastic picture quality. So, you know, well worth picking up if you like your sort of Lovecraftian and satanic type things. And we finish with, you know, what is actually quite a dull film, The Crimson Cult, which I know as Curse of the Crimson Altar. And it's got Barbara Steele, Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee. It has somebody who was very big in Coronation Street, the British soap opera. And, you know, it's got wonderful costumes in it. It's a bit Lovecraftian. It's a bit satanic. It's quite dull a lot of the time, I have to say. It doesn't quite come up to its wonderful title, Curse of the Crimson Altar. They don't make them like that anymore. And I actually saw that in the cinema. Thinking about this, I've seen, you know, quite a few of these in the cinema. I saw that in the cinema. I've seen The Wicker Man in the cinema. You know, I've seen quite a lot of these things in the cinema. I think back, and it just makes me realise how little I go to the cinema these days, because they're generally showing stuff I don't want to see. So there's a few ideas about, you know, what isn't folk horror, a few favourites, a few obscurities, the big three, as we say. But the conclusion I'm coming to making this video is that there's actually very little folk horror. There's a lot of films recently which have been made, which I don't own, some of which I haven't seen, which have been made, you know, very much in that sort of subgenre or subset, if you want to call it that, where, you know, they've obviously said, you know, we're going to make a folk horror film, in the way that Midsummer is obviously very, very, you know, self-consciously a folk horror film. Not that I'm a big fan of it myself. So, you know, now we've got a situation where we've gone from labeling things retrospectively as folk horror to people actually making them. And, you know, I'm not so sure about that. It's the originals, the pioneers, the people who create a genre or, you know, a subset without even thinking about it. And I keep using genre, but folk horror isn't a genre. As I say, it's a bricolage like horror itself. Some of it is science fiction, some of it is supernatural fantasy, some of it is just crime, but it is all based on those beliefs. So as Merlin Coverley said, maybe folk horror is just stuff set in the UK and has a rural feel and supernatural beliefs. So I think if I were to pick one film out of everything I've shown you today as the one that you should seek out that you possibly don't know, I would say it would almost certainly be The White Reindeer. So I'm going to show you that once more, and, you know, very beautiful film, so check that out. So that's my my sort of obscure tip for the top, and I'm sure lots of other people know this, have come across it. I know it's been mentioned online, but it is a film which deserves more attention. So this is Outlaw Bookseller, about to sign out. There will be more folk horror soon. I'm going to be talking about the intersection between folk horror and British fantasy fiction of the 1980s, and also the Avian Macabre of Stephen Gregory. Bye for now.